gosh, this is so exciting. I have been waiting for this interview for so long.
All right.
I love the way that you package the information and you make it palatable for people to understand.
Thank you.
And you make it fun, but you're so intelligent that it's also exciting to learn from you. So tell me, what are you enjoying about San Diego right now?
Everything. The people, the sun, and surfing in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just got back from Idaho, right?
That's right.
You're hiding out over there for COVID?
That is right. Yeah, I was in Costa Rica before then, in Austin before that, and Mexico before that, and a bunch of other places before that.
Jeez, I can't keep track of you.
Yeah.
Last time I talked to you, I think you were in Tulum.
That's right. No longer.
Tulum.
I had my share of Tulum.
Do they still have that seaweed problem on the beach?
Only certain times of the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. When I was there last time, it was like the whole beach line was covered with seaweed.
It gets really bad sometimes of the year.
Yeah. Nice. All right. Well, it's nice to have you back.
I'm just stoked to be here.
So that we can finally
always.
interview you. So your personal Instagram is called The Light Diet.
That's right.
I like that because explain to us why the light is an important and essential part of our diet, our intake.
It's a great question. So actually every diet ever is already a light diet in a sense, because if you want to distinguish between something like dirt that doesn't have any energy for us to extract and something like a banana or some kind of food that does, the difference is that the energy in the food is excited, or I should say the molecules in the food is excited by sunlight. And so when we consume that fuel, we can actually strip hydrogens off of that fuel source, funnel them into our mitochondria, and then basically extract the energy stored in the electrons of the hydrogen that is originally sunlight energy and use it. So naturally, our diet is already based on light from the food. The thing is that what I've learned, what we're missing in the world today, is the understanding or the awareness that before we started consuming food, all life was primarily organisms living off of solar energy, essentially. So we still have that in us. And a lot of our processes as an organism that evolved in the great outdoors for so many billions of years, or at least, billions of years, we require full spectrum sunlight still to function at our optimal level. A lot of processes in the body, but including vitamin D production, synthesis of nitric oxide, which allows our blood vessels to expand naturally, lowering our blood pressure naturally, our circadian rhythm, the biologic clock in our brain and throughout all of our cells. All of these things and many others are controlled by light from the sun directly and not just what we consume. So my focus on light for our diet is to kind of re-enlighten in a way people and myself too to this basic understanding and knowledge that we are creatures of the outdoors, we're beings of light, and the light that we're exposed to directly, in addition to the light we consume indirectly via our food, is really, really critical. And the modern indoor lifestyle in particular, almost like my mission statement, is to shed light on the fact that the indoor lifestyle is really harming people. It's preventing people from thriving to the max of their ability, driving a lot of the modern disease epidemic, if not all of it.
Wow.
And so on, yeah.
And that might include, aside from the inside lifestyle, wearing chemical sunscreens on the body, I would assume contribute to all of those health issues that a lot of people are having. The premise is flawed.
Yeah, the premise of sunscreen is flawed because at the end of the day, the sun is, we could always say God and the universe are the first mover, but within that plan or within that world or, that whole circumstance, the sun is more directly the mover or the cause of life on Earth.
Yeah.
And so, from every single molecule, biomolecule in our cells to every single energetic reaction that's happening all the time, all of that is driven by the sun. And for example, like our skin, the evolution of our skin was driven by the sun. The energy for it came from the sun. It adapted specifically to the sun. Same with our eye. All of the color vision that we have that we so cherish, all of that wasn't driven by some random external force. It was actually driven towards the sun, and so that we could utilize and see with wavelengths of the sun. The whole point is that everything in our body is driven by light, particularly light from the sun. And so for us to go ahead and say, oh, the sun causes skin cancer, to the inquisitive mind, there's an issue right off the bat. Like, if we evolved to the sun, not any other way, we truly were evolved by the sun and to function within its range, its spectrum. To go ahead and say the sun is the cause of skin cancer when it wasn't even a real big issue just 100 years ago is a bit absurd.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch. So how much sunlight do you think is the ideal intake?
Definitely varies between everyone. It's kind of like saying, well, how much of this food should someone eat? How much of that food should someone eat? That's going to vary. Obviously, how much water we should drink, it's going to vary. But I would say the best answer is the common, the almost cliche one, which is our body knows.
Yeah.
Your body knows. So I would say for someone who's been living we could say an indoor lifestyle where their skin probably doesn't have much melanin in it, meaning they're very, very pale. They don't have much protection against the sun because the only reason we make melanin is when we are getting, too much sun or it's summertime. Our body is trying to dissipate, not necessarily too much sun, but when we're getting a lot of sun, our body is trying to dissipate the higher energy and potentially more damaging ultraviolet wavelengths into more healing red and infrared wavelengths. And so that's what the pigment melanin does, is it takes ultraviolet and it, re-emits it basically as infrared light, and so as heat.
Yeah.
And so if you're starting from that place of like a total indoor lifestyle, you have to be very careful. Because if you do go out like on a day like today and you're very pale, you'll be burnt within 5 or 10 minutes because it's almost the solstice. It's about 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
An hour or two ago, the sun was almost as strong as it will ever be in San Diego ever.
Yeah.
Because we're so close to the solstice. So, today's the 18th, 3 more days, and then the sun's going to start receding to the southern hemisphere. So basically, the point is it varies. So if you're starting, I would say start with 5 minutes of exposure on the front and the back each day and just build that up till you have a tan. And we can get into how hydration is related to that, but that's the best thing. If you have a good tan or you don't burn, you could get multiple hours in a day. From some of the researchers I learned from, the minimum you'd want to get is like 2 hours of unfiltered sunlight per day. Doesn't mean you have to be in direct sunlight.
That's the minimum.
Minimum 2 hours.
Wow.
Again, doesn't mean shirt off sunbathing.
Yeah.
But that's just outdoors.
Yeah.
No windows
Right.
between you and the sun. So that might mean like an outdoor hour
Because the windows
walk in the
have
morning.
some sort of UV filter on them that are blocking part of the spectrum.
Yes,
so you're not
and
getting the
infrared
full...
and red, which is
Okay.
even, almost you could say even worse, that it's blocking the red and infrared, because those are the healing wavelengths.
Right.
That everyone's doing the red and infrared
Isn't
saunas.
that interesting?
Yeah.
Like, why is it not blocking the harmful?
Well, first of all, there is really nothing harmful. That's the key. But it's from the sun that we would want to block. Again, UV, too much of it is going to be damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Too much of anything is going to be damaging. Too much infrared, you'll get heat stroke,
Mm-hmm.
But the key thing is with windows today, it's actually that they're designed to be energy efficient,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that they block the infrared, which is super healing for our cells,
Yeah.
in order to reduce the amount
The
of money
heat.
that needs to be spent on air conditioning
Yeah.
in particular in the summer. And the same reason why the incandescent bulbs, or I should say LED bulbs, are becoming everywhere. And incandescent bulbs are...
Energy efficient.
Incandescents have been actually outlawed in California. Let me see if you're a lawbreaker here. Are these infrared? Ooh, Tracy's breaking the law.
That's only for commercial
those are
traces.
technically illegal in California.
For commercial.
Okay, well
only.
maybe not.
Yeah, not
Really?
residential. Yeah.
Well...
That's why, like, you go into a Home Depot and it's like all blue light
Exactly.
flickering.
So
You have a
the
headache.
reason,
You're in there for half an hour.
the reason they're illegal now is because they use so much more electricity because infrared light, what we feel as heat, which is also really, it's healing for the cells, it takes more electricity.
Yeah.
But so by subtracting out the red and especially the infrared light from these bulbs to make them more, I should say more efficient.
Right.
We're actually subtracting a key essential nutrient, almost you could say, from our brain and our cells.
So when you talk about waking up in the morning and watching the sunrise and then watching the sunset to set the circadian rhythm, would you suggest that people go outside then and not look at it through their window? Because a lot of people look at it through their window, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a nice sunrise.
I wouldn't,
or something.
because then, depending on the windows, you're likely lacking some of the red and the infrared spectrum. Different windows might distort other parts of the spectrum. And we also want, when the UV comes into the light, we actually want that because it affects our hormonal systems in certain ways. So we want to be, in my ideal prescription, which I call the light diet, there's multiple recommendations relating sun exposure. One is rising with the sun, so setting up your life so that you're going to sleep early enough to get a good 8 to 10 hours of sleep, or whatever you need to get up. Say it's 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, so we're going to bed 8, 9, 10 at the latest, I would say, on a regular basis, to wake up in the morning, to get that morning early light exposure, because that early light sets the circadian rhythm more than any other time of the day.
Oh, more than the sunset.
The sunset also does. It's really, those are the two keys, but the morning is most important because it's sort of the turning of everything on. You can kind of stimulate the sunset by wearing blue blocking glasses. Like, these are the night lenses we have, and they turn all the light to be more like sunset light.
Okay.
That's kind of the effect of putting them on, but you can't really stimulate the sunrise. We need that stimulus to get the pineal gland and the brain going, and all of the pituitary hormones and everything. That's why the sunrise is so essential. So, and the key thing is, let's say you get up at 9 o'clock, the color of the sun, particularly the blue component, it isn't changing significantly between that time and now. The sun might get a little brighter. The UV will change significantly because the UV index, or the amount of UV, increases as the sun gets higher in the sky.
Yeah.
But the blue light isn't changing significantly. But when the blue is changing, which is when it sets the circadian rhythm best, is when it rises over the horizon for the first 15 to 20 minutes. And obviously, when I first saw your place, I was like, this is insane. 'Cause you can... one of the few places probably in the city where you can just get a perfect sunrise and a perfect sunset.
I know.
So if you can sun gaze 10, 15 minutes even at sunrise and sunset, the yogi masters who do that, they always attribute a huge portion of their health and clarity and high-level consciousness just to sun gazing alone.
So let's go into that a little bit, Matt, because a lot of people are concerned with watching the sunrise and the sunset because of burning of the retina and the things that we hear about that. Do we need to have a certain amount of DHA in our system to help protect the retina from getting burnt? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing is that from sunrise, and I'm talking proper sunrise on a horizon like at the level of the ocean, and you have an even better horizon almost because you're actually above the horizon, but there's no UV when the sun rises, or very minimal, if any, for the first at least 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
The closer you get to the equator, or the closer it is to the solstice, the summer solstice, the faster the UV becomes present in the morning. But still, usually the first 10, sometimes even the first 20 or 30 minutes, there's almost no UV. And one of the best ways to tell this is, does the sun heat your skin or not?
Okay.
So once the sun starts heating your skin, there's a lot more power in it, and there's the UV. And the reason we feel that is heat, even though the infrared is technically the heat component, it's because the UV packs so much power, and when melanin slows it down into infrared light, that's where we start to feel our skin get hot.
Gotcha.
So if the sun doesn't feel hot, and if it's just come over the horizon, it is generally considered safe and acceptable to look at the sun directly for the first 10. I recommend usually no more than the first 15 minutes. Personally, I can probably look at it directly for the first 30 plus minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, again, depending on where I am. If it's the winter, it doesn't really rise up. It usually rises over, like it kind of rises horizontally almost. In that case, you can look at it for a lot longer because it's how high it goes in the sky. Because the higher it goes, the less atmosphere it's being filtered through, which means more UV comes through.
Gotcha.
But if it's kind of just grazing the horizon, like in the winter, you can look at it potentially for like 2 or 3 hours after it rises. I mean, maybe 1 to 2. Now, again, I recommend people be cautious. So usually my max recommendation is like 20 minutes after it crosses the horizon. And if you live where there are mountains, then once it comes over the mountains, you probably don't want to look at it, if the mountains are close to you, because then it's going to be pretty high.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, is like the risk of really burning the eye, there's not enough UV to do so the first 20 minutes and the last 20 minutes in general. Even if you're on the equator, the first 10 to 15 minutes are pretty safe. Additionally, great question about DHA.
And astaxanthin too, right?
Astaxanthin. Yeah. There's multiple, chlorophyll, melanin, they're all related. For the human, as a mammal, I should say as an animal in the animal kingdom, we use melanin as a primary receptacle of sunlight. Hemoglobin in our blood absorbs light. We use, just like plants do, the water in our cells absorbs light. Pretty much almost every biomolecule that I've looked into absorbs at least some specific wavelength of light. And so some of the researchers who I've learned from describe to me that because every molecule in the body, every enzyme, every protein actually has specific absorption spectra of light, it should be very obvious to us that our bodies we are beings of light. We are designed to be absorbing light. Every protein, everything, all of that light is contained in the sun. So what happens when a protein or a molecule has absorbed light, which is a form of energy, that leads to an increased rate of reaction of all of the reactions in the body. So whether it's your detox pathways or your hormone production or your neurotransmitter production or anything like that, that is all repair, energy production. All of these are optimized by light, and a few of them are really well studied, like energy production. But the point about that is that something like DHA, for example, omega-3, there's pretty good evidence to indicate that it is a very powerful conductor of energy, essentially. So the main piece of our nervous system that allows us to conduct high levels of electricity effectively through our nerves is called myelin. It's the sheathing around the nerves. And so just to give an idea of how effective or essential myelin is for this process, like when a baby's born, the way it can get the head out of the mother's vagina is that it's not myelinated yet. The brain's a lot smaller, and all that fat is stored around the baby's body. And so then that fat is used to myelinate the brain, and that the brain's made of cholesterol, saturated fat, largely cholesterol, but also myelin's made of DHA because it's such an efficient molecule for conducting electricity. And there's different theories on this. One that would make a lot of sense is that usually DHA is found in seafood because these fish are sometimes deep in the water, sometimes not so deep. But so if they can have a molecule that allows them to better assimilate and utilize light energy, they're going to be better able to survive and do everything, right? So as land animals, we can either we can get DHA if we're a cow from eating grass and converting it, although it's very inefficient. And so there's different theories about this, but I believe that their brain size and their complexity is limited by their ability to get DHA, But the higher up you go on the food chain to humans at the top, we have the highest level of DHA in our brain of any animal on Earth, effectively, except, and proportionately I'm speaking, because like certain animals have way bigger brains, so they might have more, but relatively speaking, and dolphins, and dolphins are also one human, because obviously all they eat is seafood.
Yeah.
So they're also considered one of the smartest animals out there. So yes, the answer is DHA, in addition to being critical for the function of our nervous system, I believe, based on my interpretation of the research, that when we consume it from a whole food source, not from a supplement, we are going to be incorporating it into our cell membranes and into our retina is one of the highest concentrations of DHA of anywhere in the body, so that we can take that light and turn it into a useful electrical signal. So yes, adequate DHA consumption, but not from like a high mercury source. You don't want to be eating like tuna all day long, although some's fine for a healthy person. Swordfish, shark, those are higher predator
any of the
fish.
Big fish.
Yeah, but if you eat sardines, maybe shrimp, some people don't want to eat shrimp because it's like more of a bottom feeder, but sardines are great. Sardines, mackerel, anchovies,
Shrimp.
Salmon, wild caught
I mean, not shrimp,
salmon.
I eat sardines. I don't like shrimp because they're crustaceans.
So that's sort of the key. Consuming that. Astaxanthin is another potentially beneficial compound to consume, but I'm focused more on DHA and melanin.
Yeah.
Melanin's really the key.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how sunlight activates hydration. This is a big question and something I'm really excited to get into because I get asked on a daily basis, or actually it's usually a comment on a daily basis, people will say, I drink a lot of water, but I don't feel hydrated. And so that's why we came up with the 9 pillars of health, because being hydrated isn't just about drinking water. There's all these other essentials like grounding, sunlight, movement in order to activate that hydration. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this so that our listeners can understand how sunlight activates hydration and why it is so critical for being truly hydrated.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I'm, of course, not an expert in hydration like you are, but I can talk about, how sun does affect hydration as I understand it. So one thing that comes to mind when you say that that's really interesting is how you're talking about you could be drinking plenty of water but not be hydrated. And so, for example, consider something like 5G, or just more generally, because people are putting a lot of emphasis on 5G, but EMF in general. So whether it's from a high voltage power line, a refrigerator on the wall opposite to your bed, electric fields, magnetic fields, or the more common things people consider like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phones, that EMF serves to, like Robert Slovak talks about, just dehydrate the cells, because it's energizing, just like a microwave does to something you put in the microwave. It's energizing the water, and it's actually dehydrating the cells. So you could be drinking water all day, but if you live right under a cell tower, you're probably going to be fundamentally dehydrated in general. So to me, hydration, of course, as to you, it isn't just about how much water you consume.
Right.
It has a plenty to do with that, but also even potentially more to do with how well you're able to utilize what you're consuming, or even more if we want to talk about people like Robert, people like Dr. Boros, a deuterium researcher. A key thing to know about hydration is that the body, the mitochondria make water. So our body, the end product of our metabolism is water production, because when sunlight hits a plant, it causes the water molecules to split, releasing electrons, and then the hydrogen from that H2O become bound to, for example, carbon to make up a sugar or a fat. And so when that process happens, the water has been split, and now there's basically energy that was holding it apart, because it likes to be together. But that input of sunlight energy holds it apart. Now what the plants then do with that stored energy is they have mitochondria too, so they actually put the sugar back through their own mitochondria and release it as energy, so they have energy to keep living even when the sun goes down, right? So that's pretty cool. Now humans do the same thing, except for animals do. We consume that fuel that was created by a plant, and we burn it essentially, just like burning a log, where we input a spark, we rip the hydrogens free from the carbon source that they're bound to, so they come back together and they make water again, and that releases the sunlight energy that initially split them apart, right? So we undo that reaction. It's kind of like that yin and yang, plants and animals, oxygen versus carbon dioxide cycle. And so when we make water in our mitochondria, which is where it happens, that water is always free of deuterium, first of all. So not only are we making water, but it's, as you know, you probably talked about deuterium, people probably heard your interview.
It's mostly deuterium depleted.
It's almost entirely deuterium depleted. It almost can't have deuterium, because if that deuterium did get into the mitochondria, usually the idea is that it would break the mitochondria. And so that's why making our own water is actually really, really essential. And so we want to talk about, like, how do we optimize that process of making our own water? And that's where we start
like camels do in the desert, right?
Did Robert mention that analogy?
Oh yeah, a lot of people think that there's fat or water in the humps, but it's the fat.
It's just fat.
Yeah.
So, and it's pretty cool. So if we're efficient at the process of generating energy / making water, because it's the same process. It's called basically oxidative phosphorylation, or cellular respiration in general. So if we're efficient at that, it's better to have all that hydrogen bound up to carbon in those humps on a camel's back, because it's a much, we could say, tighter storage form. You can fit a lot more hydrogens in that space than you can in the water. And so when they go ahead and react that, when you go ahead and react those hydrogens with the oxygen that's always free in the air, then you can make a ton of water, obviously, right? So as it stands, I believe the human makes an average 1.5 liters of water in our body per day. It's pretty amazing. But so, again, if that's all carried out by the mitochondria. So let's just talk about mitochondria. If your mitochondria, the cellular engines, aren't working well for any reason, and we can talk about those why those reasons would be, primary reasons being, well, basically lack of sunlight and exposure to artificial light, then we're not going to be able to make water effectively. So a better way to kind of phrase that is that, as we discussed, we evolved outdoors. One of the processes that evolved to be optimized by sunlight is mitochondrial energy production, right? And that's specifically red and infrared light. You know, all the red light therapy today and infrared saunas, those optimize mitochondrial function because we have certain cytochromes, or these proteins in the mitochondria, that absorb that light, and it increases basically their spin rates and their function, right? So if you aren't getting, so it's almost like the human being is at a certain bar of energy function or level of function based on the energy that was available in our environment to evolve to that level, right? So we're up here because that's what our environment provided. Then when we go and we decrease the energy in that environment, we can't maintain this higher level of function that required and was driven, its evolution was driven by the higher level of energy. No, it's going to revert back down to a lower level of function. I mean, and to be honest, it sounds almost crazy, but that's effectively like what autism is. That's effectively what these brain diseases are in young kids. Their brain literally can't myelinate and function properly, so they're literally cognitively, and this is, you know, not PC, but it's like a primate, like a previous primate in human, you know, succession. And therefore, and that may offend some people, but it's just looking at it, you know, for what it is, and it's a shame because, you know, the people who might be triggered by me saying something like that aren't necessarily looking for the solution, because that's what we're talking about, is fixing the environment. We want to be respectful of these kinds of conditions. It's a shame for people who have to struggle with something like that, but that's not the only condition. You know, any metabolic chronic disease in the body, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, all of these have been shown to be linked to lowered mitochondrial function. There's a lot of different theories on why that is. I believe one of the primary drivers, if not the primary driver, is that lack of sunlight exposure, which is being replaced with super toxic artificial lighting. And then also there's the deuterium issue. But to me, you know, and deuterium's a huge issue because we're consuming such processed, refined food all the time, and our water's getting higher in deuterium. But if you're in a really healthy environment from a sunlight and a light perspective, and you're not overly damaged from, you know, how you were raised and whatnot, we can generally deplete our deuterium level pretty well. Like someone in Costa Rica, they eat rice and beans, you know, and meat their whole life, and they're living often over 100 years old. So that doesn't really fit the deuterium is bad all the time narrative, because their systems to deplete are obviously really enhanced, even if they eat rice.
They've adapted.
They've adapted, and lots of humans have lived equatorially and consumed relatively high carbohydrate diets and done really well. So this is when people get into the keto versus carbohydrate versus paleo fight. It's like, guys, humans have lived really long lifespans doing almost all of them. But what humans really haven't lived a super long, healthy lifespan doing is a totally toxic indoor lifestyle in general. I mean, there are probably people you could find who inherited really good mitochondria, or they were just mentally so positive that they actually outweighed the negative effects.
That's a huge part.
Absolutely. But so at the end of the day, when we're talking about this hydration question, it's how well are the mitochondria working, and therefore how well can we carry out the process of what a camel is doing all the time, making our own water. If they work well, we can make our own water well. If they're not working well, which again would be the result of lack of full spectrum sunlight exposure, lack or excess artificial light exposure, because blue light, which is present in the sun but balanced by the healing red and infrared, when it's isolated, which it is in artificial lights, and not balanced by healing red and infrared, it can become very damaging. Whereas in the sun, it's actually beneficial, because it's kind of like the blue light stimulates a bit of stress. It stimulates us to be awake, stimulates our cortisol. It's sort of a bit of a stressor, but that stress is kind of like good stress, and the red and infrared light sort of balances that and allows us to have some homeostasis. When you're under a blue light LED or a blue light based screen, like an LED backlight screen, which is what we're all looking at all the time, that's constantly triggering not only that stress response in the brain, it's dulling or damaging the ability of the mitochondria in the eye and the retina in the brain to generate energy properly. And systemically, that chronic blue light stimulus without the healing red and infrared is overtaxing our adrenals, because blue light stimulates production of cortisol and kicks pregnenolone away from production to be our sex steroid hormones, which are essential. So it's one of the reasons so many people today have really low sex steroid hormones, can't get pregnant, don't look healthy, don't have a good body composition, because of chronic stress, whether it's emotional, psychological, or triggered by blue light and indoor lifestyle, is stealing the precursor for our sex hormones, which are very important for overall health in addition to sexual function and fertility.
Yeah.
And kicking that, because it's the same precursor as cortisol, so it's kicking it all to cortisol. So that's kind of the key. It's like let's get our mitochondrial function dialed in so we can hydrate properly.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That's kind of the idea.
That was beautifully stated. I love
that. There's more
Matt.
to it too. Yeah.
Right? Okay, so you talked about the body making its own metabolic water and how the sunlight plays a part in that. Let's now talk about another aspect of sunlight being essential to hydration, because even though we don't photosynthesize like plants do, there is a biochemical process in us that's similar to photosynthesis. And so in order to activate that hydration inside of our body, we need that sunlight as well. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's super duper interesting. So it's, there's this concept, you're probably familiar with, the fourth phase of water,
yes.
right? So there's many different terms, but scientifically it's either referred to as liquid crystalline water, EZ water, structured water, H3O2, fourth phase water. Super fascinating concept, but the best way for people to think about it is like the difference between water in a glass and egg white, because egg white is 99.5 or 0.8% water. It's almost entirely water, but it's really, I take that back. There's a bit of protein. I'm actually referring to gelatin. Mm-hmm. So when you make gelatin, all it takes is a tiny bit of that protein. Mm-hmm. The protein is a hydrophilic surface, and so this fourth phase of water requires a hydrophilic or water-loving surface to bind to, and it can create this zone around those proteins. So there's certain gelatin, I believe it's called a colloidal solution, mm-hmm. or a colloidal structure of some kind, where it's literally like 99% water, mm-hmm. but it's a completely different structure than water. It could stand up on a table. And so that's because that water is in this fourth phase zone. And so what the research, what was happening was Dr. Pollack and his team were trying to figure out, well, how is it that there's so many anomalies about water? For example, like clouds. All the other molecules in the air are equally dissipated throughout the atmosphere. Why do clouds form together? Yeah. Why isn't the water equally spaced? And that isn't something that's answered by the standard theory of water. Believe it or not, it's like we all take it for granted, but it wasn't answered by standard physics. There's a lot of other things, like how is the surface tension on the surface of water so strong that it could actually like break your bones if you come into the water too hard.
Right.
Like if based on the standard theory of standard models of water, it could not be strong enough to break a human's bones, but yet it can if you come from far enough. Yeah. So it's super, super interesting. Pollack's team sort of embarked on it, just trying to understand water better, which was huge taboo. The last person who got into water research decades earlier was totally like a laughingstock, because it was such like a touchy, sacred cow in the scientific world. But anyway, what his team discovered eventually with these, they discovered that when you have a hydrophilic surface, there is this small, tiny zone, what they call the exclusion zone, around this surface, this hydrophilic, water-loving surface, which, by the way, every single surface in the human body almost is hydrophilic, especially all of our proteins. And so basically, the reason they called it an exclusion zone is because they would have these nano particles in the water, and they would see that they were always just slightly off of the surface, and they couldn't figure it out, and they couldn't figure out what caused it to grow. Eventually, one time someone was shining a flashlight just to look, and the EZ grew really significantly. So they started testing all the different colors of light found in the flashlight and found that it's just a property of water. When it's on a hydrophilic surface, and it's exposed to infrared light, it causes this water to essentially break free from its standard configurations, which, by the way, no one really knows for sure what the configuration is of water when it's in a glass. There are theories, but nothing rock solid.
Yeah.
It breaks free from that and becomes H3O2. The water actually hops onto this liquid crystalline lattice and makes this super highly structured form that looks like a crystal, but it's viscous, like you can move it with your finger, for example, like you can with gelatin, but it's generally structured. So that, what they found is it actually is essentially like a capacitor. So when the water is actually separating, the hydrogens are splitting and hopping onto this lattice, and then there's H3O2, so then some of the oxygens are basically being excluded out.
Yeah.
So what they were able to do is put little electrodes in both sides, and they've retested this so many times, it's been retested by others to verify. You can actually extract electricity from that. So the electricity is the energy source, is that initial light that causes separation. Anyway, that's kind of like getting into the deep science.
It's so cool, though.
The coolest thing is that's when I was reading that, I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's the water in our cells.
Yes.
The water in our cells is highly, highly structured.
Yeah, inside the cytoplasm.
And it stores energy really
Yes.
efficiently. And so when we're in the sun, that's a ton of infrared light we're getting also that is building that EZ,
Yeah.
which I would go as far as saying, although the research on this is still, it's still in progress and it'll be in progress for a while, but that, what we're really looking for when we talk about being hydrated, truly hydrated, is meaning that all of that water in our cells is properly structured, And so that it's inherently, you need to be in the sun, or you need to be exposed to full spectrum sunlight, and it could be the winter.
Yeah.
Even if you go outside under a cloudy day in the winter, you're getting this huge benefit. Now, of course, though, there's a reason why Finnish people came up with saunas, because that is a massive boost of infrared light. And when they had so little for so long of the year, that was kind of their way to hook it up. And then they have such light skin that when the summer comes around, they're able to get enough UV to make enough vitamin D to last through the winter in general. But for the infrared portion of the spectrum, they kind of added this just to get a huge health boost. And anyone who's ever gone into a sauna knows how amazing that is. And that is literally infrared light helping to structure water in the cells, and then the body can, kick out the bad water. But to me, that's super critical. And one other thing is that if we get into cold water, our body creates its own infrared in the mitochondria by burning fat, and releasing heat, and that also structures the water and makes the mitochondria super duper efficient.
Yeah.
So it's like there's multiple ways to do it, but these are things that if you live out in nature, whether it's the winter, you're always doing CT, getting cold exposure, making your own infrared, and structuring the water, like in Finland. But if you're outdoors and it's the sunny location and it's the summer, you're also getting it. So it's like just by being outdoors in nature, all these things are sort of like working for us.
Yep.
But this indoor lifestyle, we just strip away all the good stuff, and we're going to be dehydrated and lacking structured water, basically.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, like, how do you feel when you're outside working in the garden or playing or running on the beach? I remember being a kid and always being at the beach, and you just feel so invigorated and you feel amazing. And then as we get older and start to go to college and are inside studying and out late, hanging out with friends and watching TV and movies, you start to not feel as well, and, people start to gain weight. It's like, oh, I used to be thinner, and then they gain weight. And I think it's just going back to the basics. Let's have some sunlight. Let's ground. Let's move. And those things are what are going to optimize our health overall, right? Isn't that crazy that we're even having this conversation? That we have to have that? Like,
well, it's funny.
Go outside and play. Go outside and get some sunlight.
I sometimes feel like I'm talking about the same things on podcasts a lot of the time. And I'm like, man, I got to go talk about something different. But at the end of the day, I realize, like, no one realizes that, like, how impactful the light is in our life. Like, just how damaging hormonally it is to always be under artificial light, and just how beneficial it is to be exposed to full spectrum sunlight.
So you keep talking about that, how damaging the artificial light is. Can you go into that a little deeper and help us understand it?
Absolutely. Yeah, you got me really stoked, actually. So I just wanted to mention one other thing from the deuterium and mitochondrial perspective, and let's get into artificial light. So that's sort of my specialty, you could say. There's this, obviously, Robert, who's an expert, much more than myself, talked about deuterium and focuses on how, as the body is aging, they believe, him and Victor, his coworker, that deuterium is sort of ultimately responsible for the increases in mitochondrial heteroplasmy, which is damage in mitochondria. Like, I just want to get this idea across a little bit more for people to really understand.
Yeah.
there is a researcher named Dr. Wallace from
Yeah.
the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's been all over the country. He worked at Stanford. He worked at a lot of different institutions. And when Watson and Crick first discovered the structure of DNA in the late 50s, all of his colleagues started studying the human genome, the nuclear genome.
Yeah.
He, on the other hand, learned that the mitochondria, our cellular engines, come from a different ancestral organism a long, long time ago that actually merged. And this merging of these two different organisms allowed for all of multicellular life to exist. Like, basically, all life would be limited to the size, shape, complexity of bacteria, which are so small we can't even see. We're so far evolved beyond them, they're all over this table and we can't even see them. That's how far we've come. The only reason that could ever happen was because of basically the concept of delegating in biology. So basically, one organism basically kind of said, you could say to the other organism, like, our expertise here is kind of being the boss around here, gathering all the nutrients, making sure you're taken care of. And then the other one's like, well, yeah, that's great. I'm really good at making energy. Mm-hmm. I'm really good at making energy, particularly with oxygen. And so how about this? But I'm making all this energy. And while I'm making all this energy, it's kind of annoying because I have to also get all the nutrients to use to make energy, all the fuel, and I have to kind of replicate my own genes and stuff. And it's like this whole process, and it's just it's not efficient. You're good at that. I'm good at this. Why don't we just trade, right? So what happened is the mitochondrial ancestor, which probably had about 1,000 genes as a primordial bacteria, gave away almost all 1,000 of those genes approximately, kept only 13 of them that it absolutely needs in itself for its energy production. The rest of those were housed in one repository, a common repository in the nucleus. And so now that all these mitochondria have kind of joined together to be subservient in a sense or collaborative with this host cell, instead of having to have, say 10, 50, 100, or even 1,000 copies of these genes in each of the mitochondria, because they each had to have all the genes to maintain their whole system, you only need 2 copies in that host cell, because it can take those 2 copies from its common repository and cross that, or basically put that information onto all of the mitochondria. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
Like, for example, if you and I and 1,000 other people, which is about how many mitochondria we each have in a cell, were to all have one same book, because we're all trying, it's a survival book. We're all trying to take care of our own survival and stuff. That's a lot of books. That's about 1,000 books of the same exact book. What if we just had one person who says, I'm going to take care of your survival. You don't have to worry about it. You could get rid of those 1,000 books and just keep 2. The reason 2 rather than 1 is for sexual reproduction, to have the recombination and the variation throughout different, over time, to increase basically diversification. So the key metric is, just by doing this sort of biological delegation, the energy savings for all those mitochondria, no longer having to maintain 1,000 genes, but each only 13 genes, all that leftover energy was left up to the hosts. So it's like thousands-fold of energy savings. And that thousands-fold of energy savings allowed for a more complex nuclear genome, which allowed for a more complex overall organism. And that was the birth of complex life. And so all of that's powered by our cellular engines, our mitochondria. It's super cool. All bacteria.
It's infinite. It's all infinite. It goes back to the creators. How we cannot even understand the tip of the iceberg of the infinite nature of our creator. It makes you fall in love more, right?
Yeah.
With this God that loves us so much. It's so awesome.
I just want, my fascination, I just want to try to understand it. And, obviously we can't understand all of it, but when I get onto this, you get me on these subjects, I'm just like, this is fascinating.
Isn't it so much fun?
I love it. So what people really need to know at the end of the day here is that mitochondrial merger sort of is what allowed complex life to evolve, right?
Yeah.
And so just like all bacteria and archaea are not only responsible for their energy production, they're also responsible for their own structure and function. Our complexity is fully dependent on those mitochondria providing energy. They are just as much a part of us as we are a part of ourselves.
Yeah.
They are integral. In fact, there are people talk about how there are 100 times or 10 times as many bacteria in our gut as there are human cells in our body. Well, there's 1,000 times as many mitochondria in the body as there are human cells. Way more than we have gut bacteria, right? So they're even more important than our gut bacteria because they make our energy. Now, here's the interesting thing is, fast forward to the modern age where we're losing the connection to nature that we've spoken about, that naturally our mitochondria have been optimized and tuned to. When their function starts to decline, like we said earlier, the overall organism is going to start to decline in function, because if you have a government, just like we were talking about earlier in a slightly different analogy, the government has a certain amount of funding and it has a certain amount of programs that require that funding. You cut that funding, those programs are getting cut.
Yep.
And in the body, the most energy demanding programs are generally the higher mitochondrial density tissues are the brain and the heart, the immune system, and the retina, the eye. And so when you cut that energy supply from the environment that we evolved, that powered our evolution to a certain point, it's not like we can maintain those high level programs like the government can't when that funding's cut. We actually lose the most complex programs.
That's a good way to
first.
put it.
Yeah, we don't lose like our heartbeat, because
Yeah.
that's more core and essential. We don't lose our maybe most innate instincts,
Yeah.
but we lose the higher level things that are the most demanding and almost superfluous in some sense, although they're not. No one would consider our intellect superfluous, but biologically it isn't. For a human it is, but for animals in the wild, they don't have that level of intellect, right? We lose that. And look at the main diseases today in the society. Heart disease and Alzheimer's are the two biggest killers. That's mitochondrial density in the heart and mitochondrial density in the brain going way down. Vision problems are one of the most common things that no one even thinks about. One of the highest mitochondrial dense tissues in the entire body. Actually, the retina is the highest density in the entire body, because the process of vision is so energy demanding. It's actually insane, the numbers. I forget exactly what it is, but it's like the retina uses more oxygen because it has more mitochondria than like entire other organ systems combined even. It's ridiculous.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
And the immune system. Look at how many autoimmune diseases we have today. It's because the immune system is also a very high energy demanding system in order for the T regulator cells to be able to properly identify what is bad. And so
Yeah.
that's part of my story, because I had a lot and I'm still recovering and working through some like food sensitivities and allergy symptoms, and that was sort of almost what provoked me into this.
Yeah.
My T regulator cells, which are high energy demand, have to be able to tell the T effector cells what to attack and what not to attack. And so if your T regulator cells are shot because your energy demands are exceeding what your body is able to produce, those T effector cells are going to run wild and start attacking stuff that isn't really harmful, like, for example, gluten. Gluten isn't good, but it's also not a killer bacteria that should elicit a crazy response. Neither are peanuts. These things aren't actually hurting us, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not maybe the healthiest foods, but anyway, they're higher in deuterium, which makes sense as to why the body freaks out. So that's really the key. Is like we are facing an epidemic of mitochondrial disease, which is so related to hydration, because the mitochondria make water.
Yep.
And so we need to just look at the things causing this. And again, it's super clear. The number one in my mind and research is light. Really damaging, because again, the best analogy for this, and then let's move into artificial light, is our cellular engines are just like the engines in a car, right? They take in a hydrogen-based fuel source, and then they require a spark to ignite and start the combustion reaction, and the combustion reaction requires oxygen. So where does that sound familiar? Well, we consume hydrogen-based fuel through our mouth, generally. And then we breathe oxygen, and we react the two together, and we make water, and that's the same reaction that a car is doing. That's the same reaction that happens in a fire.
Yep.
So if we have a problem in our engines that's caused by the factors that, for example, affect our engines, it'll be something like, let's just say your car right here were to start having some issues, right? So you're driving down the street and you're actually having trouble starting the car. You start it, it's not really accelerating properly. You get it going, but once it gets going, it's blowing black smoke. So let's say you go to the gas station and you say, well, let me put in premium gas this time in case you were doing regular, because like the premium should help, right? Because that's the issue, I think. And so then premium gas goes in, same thing, start and doesn't really start, trying to accelerate, doesn't accelerate, and then it's blowing black smoke. And then maybe it just dies on you. You're like, all right, I got to go to the mechanic because I don't know what's happening. The mechanic says, well, you're trying to fix broken spark plug. Your spark plugs are broken. They're all worn out with premium fuel. And it isn't going to work because the engine itself is broke. That's actually the same thing that's happening in our society today with our diseases. It's like our engines aren't working. Mm-hmm. Our cellular engines are malfunctioning. And that's more like an issue in the spark plugs in the car engine. So someone goes and says, okay, well, I'm going to eat a premium diet. Let me go super keto, super clean, and it might help. It could totally help. Even some supplements, which would be like fuel additives to kind of clean it out. It might help a little bit. But if the fundamental root problem, which it is for almost every disease and for most people, because we all live this indoor lifestyle, is a damaged engine, fixing the fuel source isn't going to fix the broken spark plug. So you'll still be having the same problems. And that is all too often the case with the women who do the autoimmune protocol. You know, they just get more and more and more autoimmune diseases, and they're not actually healing. They're keeping their symptoms on a lower level. Or even better example is the carnivore diet. Sorry, carnivore people, but not sorry. If your body reacts like crazy when you eat broccoli, you have a problem. And it isn't the broccoli. It is your immune system is trash.
Yeah, let's go to the source.
So let's fix the mitochondrial damage that's causing it so that you can't even eat a blueberry without basically having, shitting your brains out or whatever. Yeah. And let's talk about that. Because people have been eating that stuff for a long time and living long life. So to demonize all foods besides red meat is absurd in my mind. But, they'll not like that. But the evidence is pretty clear. So then we can talk about artificial light.
Well, that's great. I love that you brought all that stuff up. Yeah. It's so important.
It's not well known enough.
It needs to be talked about. You're right, because we should be able to eat these things without flaring up. And so what's the root cause? And so it does go back to our mitochondria, and talking about the mitochondrial health is essential. And deuterium depleted water is something that's just starting to be talked about more, but it's not talked about enough.
Well, yep.
As well as how our cells create that deuterium depleted metabolic water and how to activate that. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I'll just add on top, this is kind of where I was going thinking about deuterium depleted water. It's like, to me, deuterium depleted water is kind of like a clean diet. It's like, it'll help. And this one particular, deuterium depleted water, deuterium depleted diets, like ketogenic diets, help a lot for a lot of people. That's why there's all these movies about them. But it's still not fixing the root problem. It can, but if you're living a super toxic indoor lifestyle, deuterium depleted water is one of the few hacks that almost is so good that it actually can overpower these things. But at the end of the day, it's not going to fix the root issue if you live a toxic indoor lifestyle. And even Dr. Boros, who's one of the leading researchers in the world, he says that the water is almost not even worth drinking. And again, there's going to be there's pushback on that. I'm not sure I fully agree or understand his position there. But that the key is that we eat a ketogenic diet primarily, which is our natural diet. You'd only have fruit for the small period of time that it falls off the trees for a month tops, and then it's gone for the rest of the year. And you might have one tree, one season, one tree, but in general, you're fasting most of the time as a human, which means ketogenic. And so that's the way to make it, and that's the way to optimize the mitochondria. And even Boros isn't talking about the light side of things, but so the key is fix that root issue. The deuterium depleted water can definitely help someone who's really struggling along the way. Like, I'm going to take it because we have so many factors against us in the modern world. But it's still not, for most people, they have so many other things that are worth fixing before getting to that point. And then in the research that, for example, Robert and Victor have done, those people who lived in Russia, who apparently lived 140 plus years, they were already doing everything right in a sense. Outdoor lifestyle, probably farmers, at least grounding, getting in their sauna, getting in their cold bath. And then they had that water on top, so they lived that long. Yeah. But like the average person, if you drank that water, you might just hope to live to a normal lifespan. You're not going to get to that lifespan unless you're doing everything right. Right. Even then, you have so much against you with the chemicals and all the other stuff we're exposed to, the lifestyle, the way we were raised. The first 5, 6, 7 years.
Emotional health. There's so much.
Yep. So that's the key. We want people to do the best thing for themselves.
Yeah. I love this. This is an important conversation to have. And like we talked about in the beginning, it's just really getting back to basics. And I love talking about sunlight and grounding and hydration, because these are things that anyone can do. And I believe that being that ultimate vibrational health shouldn't be just for the rich. It shouldn't be just for the exclusive few. It needs to be for everyone, and it is accessible to everyone. And so talking about things that don't cost any money are really important for me to talk about.
The funniest thing is, like, the scripture says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And it's interesting, it kind of relates to this, like, you said only accessible to the rich, but actually the rich are usually the most messed up.
Right.
We look at people, and everyone knows this, you look at someone in a third world country, whether it's Nepal, Costa Rica, Mexico, Uganda, these people are just smiling. Yep. Like, they're happy. I mean, I haven't been to these places and had personal interactions, so the PC police might call me out and say, oh, you don't know what their lives are like. They're probably really hard. I'm sure they're really hard. Probably harder than mine in many ways. But they're happy. And anyone I know who's gone to these cultures, my sister went on a trip to Nepal in high school to help build a school. She was like, these people are so happy. Like, her friend told me, like, what do we even get? What are we offering them? They're so happy. Like, we're bringing our imperialism to them? Like, do they really want what we have?
I think we're the ones that are changed when we go do service projects over there.
Like,
it's really the heart change for us to come back and have appreciation and learn from them. I completely agree. When I was 15, I got to do medical work in an indigenous village in Guatemala. And this village was so far removed from our modern world that kids didn't even have, like the soccer ball they had was a coconut. I mean, they hadn't seen
That's
the
awesome.
Plastics, or they wove their own clothes. I'd never seen anything like it. I mean, it was like going back in time.
Seemed happy.
Happiest kids you've ever seen, running around, playing. I mean, it was really eye-opening to see how these people could have like this verb for life. And then you come home and your friends are playing Nintendo and sitting around at the TV and just depressed. We have so much depression here in the United States.
Yeah.
We're overeating and underfed inside by the toxic lights, looking at the blue light on TV, and no wonder people don't feel good. So let's just get back to the 9 pillars of health. All right, so
100%.
let's talk about artificial light and why it would benefit people to become more aware of the dangers of it.
So the biggest danger is the replacement of sunlight. I'm getting, as I talk about this more and learn more, it is clearer and clearer that we need light to function. No one would deny that. Actually, people don't realize it, but if you had to be in a dark room for an indefinite period of time, you would go insane. And that's what happens in jails. That's why prison is so effective for sedating population, because they're living in darkness. And in prisons, they might get an hour or two. So hopefully sometimes they get more time outdoors in the yard. But it's really a good way to basically sedate a very vigorous person who would otherwise maybe be causing problems in society. Like they put them in a dungeon and people basically rot, especially in the old days when they wouldn't get out and get any light. They might have their tiny window or not. Solitary confinement's a perfect example. I mean, nothing is probably more torturous if you're not like an avid meditator or something, even if you are. So, again, I'm not sure how that would be for a yogi. They could probably handle it pretty well, better than most. But nonetheless, it definitely takes a toll on you physically. Even if you're fed the same amount of calories, you'll wither because of the essentialness of sunlight. Essentialness. I'm not sure that's the word. Essentiality. But anyway, so that's the number one issue, is that artificial light was invented very, very, with great intention in the Industrial Revolution, just post-Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, in order to extend working hours.
Yeah.
So if you could, come up with a light that was a little bit brighter than just all the candlelight, you could actually extend people's working hours. The key is that candles have very little blue light, so you'll get tired if you're working around candlelight. I mean, you can always stay up if you really needed to. Back then, obviously, people worked night shifts way back in the day as guards or whatever, but blue light is the light wavelength that stimulates basically these stress hormones in the body, cortisol, ACTH, and so on. And so when electric lighting was innovated, it included a little bit more blue light than, for example, candles had. And this helped, the lights themselves just gave people brighter light to be able to see, to work longer hours. The blue light stimulated wakefulness and a little more energy. And so that was kind of the beginning of the end in some ways, because people were no longer bound to working on a, sunrise to sunset schedule. The lights kind of allowed for a different schedule. Around the same time, I believe a little earlier, the idea of time zones was starting to be implemented, actually, because in England during the Industrial Revolution, they had trains that were moving long distances. When it was actually trains that led to the concept of basically synchronized time zones, because everywhere everywhere, and everyone was kind of like totally just doing their own thing. Like the U.S. was doing their time, and when trains were innovated, they actually had to have they had to create time zones to synchronize the timetable across longer distances. Everyone couldn't just be on their own clock.
Yeah.
Because you had to have a schedule, and so everyone had to be on the same time, and that's what led to Greenwich Meridian time or Greenwich Mean Time in the United Kingdom, which is now the base of all the time zones. So with artificial light, people began working longer hours and doing so without the power of the sun, which is sort of what you could say powers our wakefulness. So a good way to think of it is like tricking the brain to stay awake without the energy that's required to power that wakefulness. So it's almost like we're stealing from ourselves the next day, or ultimately on the end of our life, in order to stay awake those extra hours when the light isn't really around to power it, right?
Okay.
That's sort of a good way of thinking about it. Now, it wasn't that bad back in the day because the lights were old incandescents. They had very little blue. So it wasn't a huge issue. When it became more and more of an issue was when we started to have fluorescent bulbs, which really are totally deficient, and people started to spend the majority of their days indoors. That's really when the main shift began. Spending the majority of our days indoors meant deficiency of full spectrum sunlight, which, although we got into some level of the detail, but not only does it, the key thing is that it reduces our mitochondrial function and our energy production, and therefore the function of all the systems in the body, because just like a rising tide lifts all boats, a falling tide lowers all boats. And so falling mitochondrial function lowers all systems function throughout the body. Therefore, as we transition to that indoor lifestyle, that's what's happening for people. We're basically devolving. So when we're exposed to artificial light, there's a couple issues that are additional to the lack of sunlight. One is that, as we mentioned earlier, there's way more blue light. And part of that is because it stimulates people to be more energized and more awake. But that is creating that chronic stress stimulus, which we know is very, very toxic for the body. Another issue is the hormonal disruption. I mean, that's kind of the same thing, the stress hormone disruption, but our body is going to be kicking away from the sex hormones and fertility and having infertility and more stress, basically. That's bad. And then we have flicker. So indoor lights actually have this flicker issue where, because they're connected to the alternating current power grid, not only are they distorted spectrums, the flicker rate actually but it really disrupts the brain. It kind of creates an additional stress, because even though it doesn't look like it, these lights, these are incandescent, so they might have a very low flicker rate. But most lights, like LEDs, fluorescents, they flicker super fast, way faster than our eye can see. And so this is an additional stressor for the body. So these are some of the main reasons why artificial light is really, really damaging to the body. It disrupts our mitochondrial function and our energy production as well.
And the brain's utilizing a lot of energy to make sense of that flicker, because the brain's trying to put in the blank spaces, fill in the blank spaces. What's happening here,
so
right?
Jack Kruse actually described it to me one time as basically like having Mike Tyson pounding on your paraventricular nucleus in the brain, because it's just like boom, 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 boom.
Boom, yeah.
It can totally wear us out.
Yeah.
And so that's a really big issue. And
it's like a silent offender, because it's not something you're noticing, but you're feeling. Like, why do I feel tired?
Exactly. So the best thing that people can do, obviously I have these glasses, blue blockers. The reason I make these is because we can actually reduce the blue so that it isn't so much higher than the red and the infrared light. So again, if there was a lot of red and infrared light in your indoor environment when we're exposed to most artificial lights, it would at least offset a lot of the risk from the blue.
Yeah.
But because it's not in most environments, we're getting that increased oxidative damage caused by blue light, the increased stress, the basically damaged mitochondrial production. And so we have a serious issue, because again, we don't have the red and the infrared wavelengths there, because they're not really they're not nearly as present in most screens as blue light is.
Yeah.
So when you wear blue blockers, like day blue blockers, for example, which is should be a yellow lens. If it's clear, it's generally a gimmick. This is reducing about 95% of the blue. Just a little bit helps with color perception, and it's okay during the day. But that way that there's never any more blue than there is red, which is kind of how we want it to be in general for optimal function.
Wait, so go back. So all those glasses that people are wearing that are clear lenses, you're saying are gimmick.
It's a gimmick.
They don't work.
Yes. The best way to explain it is that large companies who are selling blue blockers they want to have clear lenses because that's like what the market's ready for.
Yeah.
People don't want to wear colored lenses.
Right.
But the cool thing is that we have really great customers who actually are into science and they understand the risk and they don't want to buy anything that isn't working for them.
Yeah.
So they'll actually invest in something that's going to work. But the key, and I should say they're willing to wear something that's colored if it's what's necessary. The key thing is when light passes through a lens, if the lens appears clear, it means that there's no real significant change in the light that's passing through in the visible spectrum. You can block the ultraviolet because we can't see that and you wouldn't know. But if you have one composition of light coming through a lens in the front and it comes out the back side, by definition the lens will appear clear. That's what makes the lens clear, lack of change. So when you reduce the blue components specifically, if you measure the light that's coming in the front here, it's going to have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet, and infrared and ultraviolet because we don't have a glass window blocking us right here. Then when it would come out, when you take all that blue out, you're not going to have blue anymore, so you're going to have red, orange, yellow, and green. And so when you recombine red, orange, yellow, and green, this is the color they make, is that yellow. Whereas when you have all of the colors, they combine to make what we consider clear, or just the normal colors that we're used to seeing.
But when you go into those stores, because I asked the same question, I'm like, how does this doesn't seem like it would work. The saleswoman, she shined a blue light through the lens, and then
I love that you're
says,
asking this.
"Oh, this is look, it doesn't pass through. It deflects off
Perfect.
of the lens."
So, very easy. There is the range of blue light on the spectrum of light. All light is measured by nanometers, like that's the wavelength. And so different nanometers, different wavelengths correlate to different colors in our brain. So the blue range goes from about 405 or 410 nanometers to 500 nanometers. 500 to about 550, 560 is green.
Okay.
And then beyond there, 560 to about 580 is yellow, red, orange, yellow, and then orange, and then red is past 600. So the blue is, again, we're focused on blue. It's about 400 to 500 nanometers. It's like one of the widest ranges of colors that we perceive to be similar. There's light blue, there's dark blue. It's all in the same range. Then it goes into violet and ultraviolet. So the light that's emitted by the sun is a full spectrum, from the ultraviolet all the way down to like 370, all the way up to far beyond 700, 800 nanometers. That's the infrared range, so ultraviolet to infrared. The light emitted by our most common lighting devices, LED lights, is emitting blue light not from 400 to 500, but really only from about 440 to 480 in general, right?
Okay.
So 440 to 480. So if you shine a laser through, so for example, a better way to put it is, if you block all the blue light from 400 to 440, but screens aren't really emitting much before 440, they're emitting 440 to 480,
Okay.
you're blocking a lot of blue light, but you're not blocking the blue light that's an actual risk. The best analogy I can give is, it's like if you went to war and you're wearing a gas mask,
Yeah.
and the gas that you're getting bombarded with is fluorine gas, and you're wearing a mask that only protects against chlorine. I'm not even sure if that is a real thing.
Okay.
But so you're blocking some of the gas, but not the stuff that's actually what's present in our devices. So
do you think these companies know this?
I would hope not, but I think they do. So here's that laser that they point. It's a 405 nanometer laser. It's almost purple. It's almost purple. Sometimes it's 410. That'll look a little more blue.
Then they would have to know if they're using that specific laser.
They know.
Yeah.
I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but they should know, and if they don't, they're, one of my friends says you're either a scumbag or you're an idiot.
Yeah.
And so it's one of the two. Basically, that's a 410 nanometer laser, 405, 410. So you shine that laser, the lenses are blocking 405 nanometer
Right.
light or 410. That's great, but the only source that emits that is the sun. And we're, obviously, as we've discussed today, we're not in favor of blocking that. I don't recommend, we didn't really touch on it, but I don't recommend wearing contacts or sunglasses. If you have to wear glasses, wear the glasses, but take them off as much as you can so you can get the light on your eye. But so imagine that. They're shining a laser that shows 405 nanometers, and the lens blocks that. They block all the way up to 420. After 420, their blockage drops off completely.
So you're hurting yourself by wearing those blue light blockers outside in the day.
Yes, you're hurting yourself by wearing them outside during the day, and you're also kind of hurting yourself by deceiving yourself by wearing them in artificial lit situations. Unless you're, the placebo, there is some benefit to a placebo, right?
But not enough.
Not enough.
I love that you're bringing this up. This is really important because this is one of the reasons why I started this podcast. Is I'm a truth seeker and I want
people
science.
Need to know this.
People need to know the science because we're being sold in a lot of places different things for people that don't understand the science like you do. And then you go to a store, you go to a retail store, they shine that light on those glasses, and it seems like a convincing argument. Like, okay, yeah, this seems like it would work, so I'm going to go home, sit in front of my computer, wear these clear blue light blockers, and I'm protecting myself when we're not.
Yeah. They actually add this shiny blue reflective coating on the lens, which reduces the blue between maybe 3 and 7% maximum. So people see, oh, you see the blues reflecting off. It's almost none. It's like 3 to 7% of the range that isn't even the range that's emitted by our devices. So that's really where the issue comes in. And then obviously we have these orange or even blood orange light red lenses, which at night, these lenses block basically everything up to 450 nanometers, which is the highest energy damaging blue, and the vast majority up to 500 nanometers, which is still the blue that can disrupt our eyesight, damage, affect our hormones, damage our eyes, cause all these sorts of disruptions during the day, lower our productivity, our cognitive clarity and function. These block all the way up to 550 nanometers, which is all of the blue light and about 90% of the green light as well. And the reason we'd want to block green at night too is because just like blue is higher energy, green light is a little higher energy than the colors of fire, which are red, orange, and yellow. So we really only want the red, orange, and yellow colors coming through our night lenses because those don't affect our circadian rhythm almost at all. After the sun sets, we put these on. Now, if you're like you and you have great lighting in your house that's very warm, you almost don't need these at night. You could just use the day lenses or just use none at all, just use candles in your house at night. But for people who are going out, like if I ever go out at night, I'll wear these. Very occasionally, like when we were at your house, I wore these at night because, again, your lighting is almost completely blue-free because you have these great incandescent Edison bulbs. So that's kind of the deal.
Yeah. Coming through my house and telling me what to order.
Listen, I'm so glad you did. You're one of the few who's super proactive. So, it's really, really cool stuff. I'm super glad that we can share this information with people. At the end of the day, one other thing I would add is it's, someone who I just did a podcast with last week or even, it was 2 days ago. He basically said to me, you're telling people to not be afraid and not have fear, because I'll always focus on at the end of a show in particular that I like Joe Dispenza a lot, and there's other people who teach similar messages, but there's also research on light in the body, which we didn't get into. We could that shows that our cells actually use low-level photons called biophotons, light created by a living organism, biophotons, to communicate, and that healthy cells retain their light very well, but sick cells are actually leaking a lot more light. They're more and stressed cells are leaking more light. Diseased cells are leaking more light, and the light is a lot less coherent in a way. So there's less organization. So someone who's stressed, you could probably soon enough, the technology will be there. You probably could even now with certain cameras. The light is they're gonna look less coherent as an organism versus someone who's just totally in a Zen mode, meditating. Their light's going to look more coherent. But where this is really, really interesting and relevant is that, first of all, just innately, the fact that we are beings of light is kind of cool, and that the research is actually showing that is pretty interesting. But so if you do all the stuff right to get the light in and to try to, optimize your light diet, the steps of the light diet, we've kind of skimmed on them, but step 1 is to sleep with the sun, step 2 is to wake with the sun, step 3 is to live outdoors during the day to the extent possible, as much as possible, and sunbathe even a little bit within healthy doses. Step 4 is to drink unfluoridated high quality spring water or even deuterium depleted water if you're sick. 5 would be consume adequate amount of DHA from a healthy seafood source and a general seasonal diet, seasonal meaning mostly ketogenic throughout the year. Then that's 5. 6 is to take cold baths. We discussed the benefits. getting the mitochondria to make their own infrared. That's a way people can actually burn off their fat and lose weight, like that surgery that freezes your fat. But this is a better way to do it if you do it through Jack Krus's cold thermogenesis protocol plus the leptin reset protocol. Most people who do that fat freezing, it comes right back because the hormonal issue in the brain hasn't been solved.
Yep.
So if you reset your circadian rhythm and the leptin receptor in the brain using his leptin RX reset, and then the cold thermogenesis on top of that, you can lose that weight and actually keep it off. So, he lost 107.
What's the leptin RX reset?
Leptin reset is basically created by Dr. Jack Krus, a simple dietary and circadian rhythm reset protocol. Basically just involves eating a 50-gram protein breakfast within 30 minutes of waking up after watching the sunrise. And that sounds like, whoa, that's a lot of protein. That's like 8 eggs or, like a big piece of meat or fish or something. Maybe you could potentially do a smoothie, although he doesn't really recommend that. Like with 50 grams of protein powder, that'd be a lot easier. But the whole point is protein stimulates satiety. Okay. So it's like if you wake up, you watch the sunrise, and then you consume a lot of protein to stimulate satiety, and then fat if you're still hungry after that protein, you will not basically crave carbs all day, which is one of the biggest issues because carbs kind of dysregulate our brain's reward centers. Like anyone who has a carb addiction, sugar addiction, I've had that for a long time in my life, that carbs are like crack. So if you can wake up in the morning and especially for people with mitochondrial issues, carbs are much in a sense more easily burned than fats.
Yep.
But at the same time, they're a much higher deuterium, lower quality, less desirable food source. So if you get up in the morning, you watch the sunrise to set the circadian rhythm and time that big protein breakfast there, your body will start, your circadian rhythm will start to, of not just the brain, but all the peripheral clocks will start to be timed. So that food consumption actually stimulates the circadian rhythm of the liver, the gallbladder, the gut, because when food comes in, it has to wake up, even if there's a disconnect between your brain and your body. So it gets that all timed up. And he recommends minimum 4 to 6 weeks to do that. And I've heard so many people who are part of his community have had the biggest changes in their life. They just, they lost tons of weight with doing nothing else. But so you do that, you get your leptin hormone working again, and then you add cold thermogenesis on top, and then you can lose a lot of weight by burning it off as fat, because part of when we get into cold water, it causes the release of a lot of leptin in our body, which furthers that kind of fat burning, essentially. And again, he has some really great detailed blogs that get deep into the detail and the science, but it's very powerful to do that. So when we're talking about the human being, being of light, and we're talking about someone like Joe Dispenza, the reason I bring him up is because if you're taking in all this good light, you're doing all this stuff, but we were actually going through the steps of the light diet. We were on 6 cold. 7 is avoid EMF, and that's a whole separate conversation, which we could get deep into. I'm always open to it. 8 is cultivating our inner light.
Yeah.
So the reason for that is because if we're taking in
that 8, cultivate
our inner light, because you take all this light in, but if you don't do anything with it, it's like you still maybe be a boring person or an unhappy person. So, and that took me a while. I was like, there's a missing step of the light diet, and it was all part of my own personal journey.
So is that cultivating the inner light, is that a spiritual
light? Yes, that's correct. I mean, I would say so, but it's cool because the science has indicated that we have this light in our body, but it doesn't have the ability, it can measure quantity, but it can't really measure quality necessarily. Right. But the spiritual stuff can. So if we're getting all this good light in from the first 7 steps and then avoiding EMF and avoiding artificial light that disrupt and help us kind of cause us to leak in a sense by creating a stress, but then we have all this emotional stress in our life. It's like you could be laying in the sun all day and be super charged up, but if you're just freaking out all the time,
it's depleting it.
You're gonna leak all your light out.
Yeah.
It's a simple way to put it.
Yeah.
So to me, that's another really key thing, and that's why that's how all these things fit together.
It's essential. Yeah.
It's critical. So that's kind of like the final step, And then someone who I spoke with 2 days ago, he asked me, well, you're saying to people, well, don't worry, do the Joe Dispenza stuff. Don't be fearful. Don't get too worried about this stuff. He's like, how do you reconcile that with this information, which for a lot of people is kind of concerning,
Yes.
They're like, they need to change. And I was
right.
thinking for a second, I was like, that's a really good question. And then I realized, well, think about it. Stress is good in short doses, right? Like a lion attacks you. You don't want to not be stressed when a lion's running at you. Like you need to be stressed.
You need it for survival.
So it's the same thing. You hear this information. It is something that you probably ought to be stressed about. If you're drinking tap water, you're eating poop all day long. You're literally, never going outside. It's like, you probably should be a little stressed, but like, don't let it happen for a year. Like, use it for a week or two, or even a couple days.
Yeah.
Make the changes, do the best you can, and then decide that you're going to stick with that. And if it keeps stressing you out, it's either like, well, I'm just worrying about this too much. The better way to put it is, decide, are you willing to make the change or not? If you are willing to make the change, and then you won't be stressed anymore. And if you're not willing to make the change, accept it and stop worrying about it.
Yep.
But if that same stress keeps coming up, that's probably God or your intuition speaking to you, saying, well, you probably shouldn't be eating this, or you probably shouldn't be staring at your screen so late at night. So it's like, there's a benefit to stress, but getting into a chronic state of fear forever, which is something I totally did when I first learned about EMF and this and that, that isn't going to help. Just make the right moves and then move on,
Yes.
And if something keeps crawling in your head, like, oh, you got to do this, maybe you should listen, or determine that it's not something to be, maybe it's not divine, maybe it's from Satan,
Yeah.
That's kind of like my best analysis to that question. I hope that helps people.
No, that is very helpful. I love it. This is so much good information, Matt. We're gonna have to have you on again because we needed to go even deeper.
We could do a whole call about EMF. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
That'd
we
be
can
legendary.
go even deeper. So I want people to know more about this. You have these amazing glasses. I use them. I get my friends to use them. These are gonna help with all the benefits that we talked about, protecting our melatonin, which is our most powerful antioxidant, helping to keep the reset
So
of our
funny.
circadian rhythm.
We didn't even talk about that. Yeah.
The melatonin? Oh.
Yeah, I'm like, what? So when we talked about the risks of artificial light, I was talking mostly daytime, but the simple explanation, obviously you know this, but is when we're exposed to that blue light at night, it's way worse than during the day. It's already bad during the day because of the sunlight deficiency issue, but at night, it's actually telling the brain, hey, wake up, make more cortisol, and then that is causing the suppression of, like you said, melatonin, which is, the research is clear too. It's essential for proper, it's as an antioxidant, for repairing the mitochondrial DNA, which is part of where when we talk about this issue of artificial light and the mitochondrial stuff we talked about earlier, all this damage, all these diseases, that's specifically damage in the mitochondrial DNA that's expressed in the structure and function of the mitochondria. Mm-hmm. The main molecule for repairing mitochondrial DNA is melatonin.
Yes.
So blue light at night is horrible because artificial light in general, which contains blue. So that's why we wear the glasses. That's the key.
So in simple terms, because people like to know how it's going to benefit them, I like to say this helps keep my sex hormones balanced. This helps me stay youthful because I'm going to sleep better and protect one of my most powerful antioxidants. It's also going to help keep that svelte figure that I want because I'm not going to be producing as much cortisol at night. I'm going to be producing more melatonin. So those are the benefits that I look to for these glasses. And I think other people would really enjoy I
There's
can
several.
look good, feel good. We all want that,
Better
right?
sleep, and it's like you sleep. It's basically the simplest hack. You're still sleeping maybe the same amount of hours every night, but the sleep's going to be deeper and more efficient and more productive, right? Yeah. Again, there's many other factors that are involved. If your emotional life's a wreck, if you're never going outside in the sun, these aren't going to help you as much. The best I always tell people, if you can combine these glasses as one piece of the light diet, you can combine these glasses with watching the sunrise, with sun exposure during the day, or at least getting out early in the morning, as early as possible, and then slap these babies on as soon as the sun goes down until the moment you go to bed. That's great. And if you can't work from home in your own lighting or outdoors, because you don't want to wear these outdoors, that's the key, because we want to get the full spectrum of sun. These, if you have to work in an office or go to school, you wear these during the day when you're in school, and they let through more light than the night lenses, so you can see a lot better while still being protected from the blue. That's kind of the key. So, but again, sunlight is key. I tell people, it might sound like a sales pitch here. The sun is the key, and that's all you really need.
Yeah.
The glasses are a super useful hack for the modern world, but the people, those little kids in Africa, like Africa or Venezuela, Guatemala, like they're
not using these.
Not necessarily using these glasses, but they're a lot healthier than we are. So
yeah.
that's kind of the idea there.
I love that you said these are great for the modern world because that is an important and essential element to staying well in the modern world right now, because we look at, like, you go back 100 years, it was different. Being healthy was different, the tactics we needed than we do now. So what do we need now in this modern world? And this is an essential part. So thank you for coming and sharing this stuff with us today.
Stoked.
How can people learn more about you? Where can they find you?
Awesome question. Yeah, so we have rawoptics.com. That's my company website. That's where we sell these products. We have Instagram raw_optics, and then I have my personal Instagram, The Light Diet.
And raw is RA.
RA, that's correct. Yeah, that's the sun god of Egypt, guys, not raw like RAW, raw, it's raw.
Right.
RA. It's not RA optics either, it's raw optics. You know, someone was joking with me. They're like, those people who call it RA, they need to get a history lesson. I'm like, well, it's just not that commonly known. Part of it is the education. As people become familiar with the mythological Egyptian sun deity of sunlight, but also healing and medicine, people will be, as this goes more mainstream, that means that I'm succeeding is basically my point. When people learn who Ra is or was, it'll be really cool. So basically, that's the key. The Light Diet, my personal Instagram, people can, I'll post updates there. We're going to be doing a lot of cool things in the coming months with a website. Down the road, we'll be, always improving our products in various interesting ways for people to stay posted on. It's just really, really cool stuff. And yeah, it's like lots of good stuff. So
thank you for coming and
People will
sharing
like
all
it.
of your wisdom. I appreciate
and
it.
the Light Diet podcast will be coming
that's
out
right.
eventually.
You have that coming out.
Yeah, it's in the works. So that'll be something interesting. We've got to talk about some hydration.
We're gonna have another conversation, and I'll come talk about hydration.
And we'll use your studio. So awesome.
I love it. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Tracy.
Have a great day.